Imagine wanting a raise and your boss tells you to go plow another field. Welcome to the glamorous life of medieval serfs. Many picture serfs as medieval slaves, chained to the soil with all the freedom of a phone on airplane mode forever. But before you start drafting a Free the Serfs punk anthem, let's bust that myth. The truth? Serfs were tied to the land, not sold like used smartphones. Unlike slaves, they couldn't be bought or sold individually, unless someone purchased the entire farm, sheep included. Feudal law actually gave serfs some rights. They could start families, manage small plots, even sue their lords in court. Imagine the paperwork. A few clever serfs saved up or struck deals to buy their freedom, though career advancement mostly meant becoming a slightly better-dressed serf. Serfdom wasn't a one-size-fits-all deal. Rules and obligations varied wildly by region. Thanks to market shifts and, let's be honest, lords who needed cash, plenty of serfs negotiated their way out or just sneaked off. In the end, freedom wasn't a big emancipation bash, more like a slow shuffle toward peasantry, ideally minus the hangover from 100 mandatory feast days. While serfs were not simply slaves, their living conditions often led to perceptions about their cleanliness. Picture peasants as mud-caked potatoes with a splash of desperation. Did they ever actually meet a bar of soap? Let's clear the medieval air. The classic image of peasants auditioning for Europe's next top swamp monster is wildly overcooked. Victorian writers, forever eager to showcase their progress, loved to paint the Middle Ages as one endless festival of filth. But fast forward to reality, and those so-called dirt devotees were keener on hygiene than you'd think. Bathhouses dotted towns, rivers weren't just dramatic drowning props, and even the humble damp cloth got its day in the sun, usually before church or a rare festivity. Clean clothes and swept floors mattered. That's right. If everyone had truly reeked, lice would have needed event parking, and eau de compost would have been the hottest scent for social climbers. In truth, villagers complained about smells, so staying moderately tidy was basically community approved. So next time you see peasants marinating in mud on screen, remember, it definitely wasn't by choice. And now, let's wade into why clean habits mattered even to the humblest serfs. Along with assumptions about their hygiene, peasants' diets were also thought to be monotonous and unvarying. Picture a medieval peasant endlessly gnawing on a bowl of gray, gloppy mystery sludge. Yum, right? For some strange reason, centuries of storytelling have branded every peasant's breakfast, lunch, and dinner as entries in the Bland Food Hall of Fame. Gruel, the original meal prep hack. Just add water and drastically lower your expectations. But before you RSVP to the world's saddest cooking class, let's clear the air. The idea that peasants subsisted on nothing but flavorless gruel is less history, more tired cliché. Their diets danced with the seasons, geography, and whatever the fickle soil grudgingly offered. Sure, porridge was their reliable sidekick, whole grains keeping humanity alive since forever, but so were veggies, legumes, eggs, dairy, and, on occasion, meat. Picture garden onions, leeks, cabbage, and herbs bringing the party, plus seasonal treats like wild berries crashing the table. True, the only Michelin star a peasant earned was from accidentally stepping on a horseshoe, but trust me, no one was stuck starring in an endless oatmeal commercial. Honestly, if peasants had food blogs, Church gruel goals would never be trending. Their limited diet was tied to the belief that peasants remained fixed in their villages for life. Picture medieval peasants chained to mud huts, never venturing farther than the neighbor's cabbage patch. Cozy image, right? Classic myth. Peasants as homebodies, their lives and dreams confined to one muddy patch of turnips. If you believe the legend, the only journey they took was stumbling into the next rut in the road. But reality? More like peasants on parade. Truth is, these folks packed their bags for more than just pest control. Fairs beckoned, markets buzzed, and pilgrimages, medieval road trips with a holy twist, were all the rage. Records show thrifty peasants hoofing it across counties, chasing better rents or drought-free digs. Even the church played medieval TripAdvisor, urging everyone onto the long road to Canterbury. Sure, some were serfs stuck to the soil, but not everyone was sprouting roots. Trade routes blossomed, and the only thing truly nailed down in the Middle Ages? Bad dental hygiene, not the peasants. After all, if they never left home, how did so many end up lost in the next shire over? This stationary existence fed into the idea that peasant life consisted solely of labor, devoid of leisure or enjoyment. Picture peasants as miserable medieval robots. Wake up, toil, sleep, repeat. But is that the whole story? Popular belief turns peasant life into an endless slog of sowing, reaping, and moping, as if everyone in a tunic never cracked a smile. Maybe that's because medieval art and literature show folks looking like they lost both the lottery and their last potato. But let's bust the gloom myth wide open. Peasants definitely worked hard, but they also had a jaw-dropping number of days off. So many holidays you'd think their union reps were actual wizards. Religious festivals, saints' feasts, and fairs kept the calendar hopping, and communal games popped up more regularly than a muddy tunic. Sports, dancing, singing, and even medieval football, think soccer with a side of mild chaos, brightened the grind. All work and no play was a slogan better suited to silent monks than mud-splattered villagers. Friday night plans? Survive the week, then dance around the maypole like there's no tomorrow. Moreover, the notion of endless work was connected to stereotypes about peasants' lack of education and literacy. Picture a medieval peasant squinting at Chaucer by candlelight. Wait, who slipped him that book? And is it even his turn to hold the candlestick? The classic myth says peasants couldn't scribble their own names, let alone pen a grocery list. But in reality, medieval literacy was as patchy as a thatched roof, depending on when, where, and how loudly your family's coin purse jingled. Some rural folk could recite a prayer, recognize a letter or two, or leave scratchy little marks. Less Shakespearean sonnet, more proto-emoticon. Before you write them off as utterly clueless, remember, churches doubled as medieval news anchors, and oral gossip networks ensured everyone knew exactly who stole whose cow. Monasteries, schools, and even town guilds churned out a trickle of education. Peasants sometimes contributed signatures, or their proud little X, on legal documents. By the late Middle Ages, townsfolk and ambitious peasants were reading more than just their overlord's grumpy tax demands. Honestly, the hottest peasant read might have been How to Outsmart Your Overlord in 5 Easy Steps, margin illustrations included for extra flair. Their supposed illiteracy was often linked to the belief that peasants had short, unhealthy lives. Think medieval peasants dropped dead at 30, surrounded by mud and potato crumbs? Think again. The classic image has our plucky peasant protagonists gasping their last breath just as their one tunic finally fits. An age TikTok would label ancient. But here's the medieval plot twist. Those dismal life expectancy stats are sneakier than a tax collector. They're dragged down by a brutal childhood lottery of plagues, accidents, and water so questionable it could lose a debate with pond scum. Make it to adulthood, though, and suddenly you're cruising toward your 50s or even 60s, old age with a side of more wrinkles than teeth. The medieval dental plan, chew carefully. The myth of the tragic 30-something peasant stubbornly survives because math is hard, and survivorship bias is even harder. Don't let the gloomy averages fool you. Peasants weren't programmed to self-destruct at 29. They outwitted wolves, weather, and questionable cooking. Real-world skills, not just party trivia. This fragile existence contributed to the myth that peasants unquestioningly obeyed their lords without resistance. Imagine your boss orders you to deep clean the entire office, every nook, every keyboard, every coffee mug, armed only with a toothbrush. Do you just nod and say, "Aye, my liege"? Unless you're auditioning for a medieval torture reenactment, probably not. We often picture medieval peasants as human Roombas, scuttling about castles and fields at the slightest twitch of a lordly eyebrow. The legend goes, lords pulled all the strings, peasants shuffled like powerless pawns on history's damp chessboard. Here's the plot twist. Real peasant life was less mindless obedience and more, "That's not in my contract, sire." Peasants debated in village councils, leaned on customary rights, and collectively decided who got the joy of mucking out the hog pen. When a lord overstepped, legal complaints flew, outright refusals popped up, and strategic disappearances became the medieval mic drop. Quiet quitting, circa 1381. And when diplomacy failed? The English peasants' revolt proved that poke a peasant too hard, and, well, pitchforks aren't just garden tools. Turns out, the only thing peasants obeyed without question was lunchtime. Their blind obedience was thought to be reflected in their plain and unremarkable clothing choices. Picture every medieval peasant ever. Brown sack, dirt streaks, and an aura of potato-based despair. If you believe pop culture, and let's be honest, half the Renaissance fairs you've crashed, the Middle Ages were shot exclusively in sepia. The legend says peasants rocked only brown, beige, and 50 shades of mud. Outfits so dull, today's cardboard boxes would feel downright haute couture. But here's the plot twist. Real medieval peasants actually dabbed in a colorful palette. If they scraped together enough pennies, or traded a chicken or two, they might sport reds, blues, or yellows. Sure, rare dyes cost more than a unicorn's autograph, but homespun fabrics and local plant dyes yielded subtle greens, cheerful ochres, and soft blues. Sumptuary laws mostly bossed around the aristocracy, not everyday hues. So while the poorest, think perpetual mud wrestling champ, stuck to browns and grays, the rest brightened things up with stripes, checks, or clever weaves. Bright clothes at a festival? It helped peasants stand out, or at least made sure medieval tinder wasn't just brown, brown, brown. Nope, still brown. Peasant style. Not runway ready, but definitely not sackcloth sad. See? You can be a trendsetter, even with manure on your boots. Similarly, their unadorned attire was seen as a sign of broader ignorance about science and the world. Ever heard the one about medieval peasants thinking the earth was flat? Spoiler, they weren't quite that clueless. The only thing flat about your average medieval villager was probably the stale bread they gnawed on, and maybe a tragically underbaked pie. The myth paints peasants as illiterate bumpkins, hopelessly oblivious to science or the globe's shape. But in reality, their survival depended on knowing exactly how the world worked, even if their classroom was a muddy field rather than a fancy lecture hall. These peasants read the land better than any influencer with a weather app. They could sniff out a storm brewing by the scent of cow dung and knew exactly which herbs would cure a queasy belly. If ignorance were bliss, medieval villagers ought to have been the happiest folks in Europe, though try telling that to someone sweating over crop rotations. Sure, most couldn't decipher Latin treatises, but practical knowledge flowed through stories, festivals, and astrological calendars. Their university? Life itself turned up to 11. This supposed ignorance extended to beliefs about peasants always suffering from hunger. Picture this, a scruffy medieval peasant clutching an empty bowl, eyes wide with the desperate hope for a single sad turnip, like all of Europe was stuck at an eternal, gloomy banquet hosted by Oliver Twist's less generous cousin. But hold your communal moaning. Was daily starvation really the peasant baseline, or are we just confusing historical hangry for historical reality? The myth insists peasants survived on scraps, gruel, and pure optimism. In truth, their diet was often surprisingly hearty, especially after decent harvests. Bread wasn't just the headliner, it was basically the whole cast. And while medieval cookbooks might as well have been titled, "Add More Bread," peasants supplemented the carbs with vegetables, dairy, eggs, and, on lucky days, actual meat. Sure, catastrophes like the Great Famine of 1315 could turn the pantry into a ghost town, but most days hunger was less a permanent companion and more an unwelcome guest. So yes, variety was a rare luxury, but at least farm-to-table was strictly enforced, usually by the table itself. Additionally, hunger and hardship were often linked to strict and oppressive gender roles within peasant life. Picture medieval women silently churning butter while men made all the big decisions, because that's obviously how history rolled, right? If women really had no say, then who decided when dinner was ready? A medieval Alexa? The myth paints peasant women as faded wallpaper, voiceless, powerless, just background noise to men's heroic exploits. But hold on tight. Reality had a few more wrinkles, and definitely more mud. Women weren't just sidelined scenery. They plowed fields, hawked wares at markets, and balanced budgets sharper than any sword. While husbands vanished on pilgrimages, battles, or epic beer runs, wives ran households and businesses like seasoned CEOs. Some even inherited property and called the shots after the menfolk made their exit. Marriage wasn't just dad trading daughters for chickens. Negotiations happened, and women's voices counted. Festivals and church gatherings gave women a platform. Yes, an actual village voice. Local courts sometimes ruled in women's favor on inheritances and domestic disputes. Peasant women didn't just harvest crops, They planted ideas too, and if you think medieval men never listened to women, you've clearly never met a mother-in-law. So bridging myth and fact, medieval society was way less one-sided than our fairy tales would have you believe. These rigid roles reinforced the idea that peasants had no opportunity for social advancement. Ever heard the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Medieval peasants couldn't even afford boots, let alone straps. Yet the myth persists that any ambitious serf could climb the social ladder to a castle, or at least upgrade to a slightly less drafty hovel. In reality, medieval society treated social mobility like a fairy tale, though, funnily enough, fairies were actually more likely to show up and grant 3 wishes than a peasant was to trade mud for marble. Land wasn't earned by grit. It was inherited, and peasants owned just enough dirt to call home. The only ladder they climbed was the wobbly one to fix the leaking thatched roof. Sure, there was a slim chance to join the clergy, if you could read, or make a name wielding a rusty pitchfork in someone else's quarrel. But medieval job interviews basically went, so, your grandfather was a peasant? And so are you. Ambition? Mostly crossed fingers, hoping the next turnip crop wouldn't be a disaster. Tales of peasants hitting the social jackpot were about as believable as a knight's fishing story where the fish grows bigger with every telling. If you wanted real upward mobility back then, you'd have better luck inventing the elevator. Despite this, it was commonly assumed that peasants lived in close proximity to imposing castles owned by their lords. Imagine a medieval neighborhood where every peasant's morning commute was a mere stone's throw from a majestic castle. Moat views included, with a complimentary whiff of drawbridge musk. The enduring myth: peasants living snugly in the castle's shadow, always ready for moat mishaps or last-minute dragon drills. But let's lower the portcullis on that fantasy. In reality, most peasants couldn't glimpse a castle, let alone stroll past one on their way to milk the goats. Country folk were scattered across villages, heads down in their fields, not polishing noble armor atop spiral staircases. Castles weren't medieval condos with rustic charm. They were rare, heavily fortified mansions reserved for lords and their VIPs. Even if you dreamed of that castle life, local real estate wisdom was clear. Location, 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 just not within catapult range. Sure, a few peasants worked near castles, cooking, smithing, or cleaning, but for most, a castle visit was market day, or a crisis. For the average villager, castle life was as distant as the royal family's taste in hats. Yet even near these centers of power, peasants were believed to lead lives isolated from wider society. Imagine a medieval peasant stuck in a never-ending game of Where's Waldo? Except Waldo is modern civilization, and you're convinced he's lurking right behind the sheep. The popular myth paints these peasants as cut off from everyone but their cows. No news, no visitors, not even a rogue carrier pigeon with a bad sense of direction. Legend has it that your average peasant barely glimpsed a town, let alone caught wind of world events, their most worldly encounter being a prolonged, suspicious eye lock with the neighbor's turnip patch. But let's set the record straight. Villages back then were buzzing hives, not castaways on an island, more like chronically late to the village festival. Markets and fairs popped up like medieval Coachellas, bringing news, trends, and wily travelers from far and wide. Pilgrimages and seasonal jobs meant peasants often ventured well beyond their home turf. Gossip? It zipped around faster than medieval Wi-Fi, aka shouting across fields. Local life? Rich and noisy. Isolated? Don't bet your last cabbage on it. In fact, peasants weren't hiding under informational rocks. They were busy tossing stones over them, spreading the latest scuttlebutt far and wide. This isolation was thought to result in a lack of humor or joy in medieval peasant life. Imagine a world so grim that even knock-knock jokes could land you in the stocks. Welcome to the medieval peasant life. The mental image? Mud-splattered, turnip-munching serfs with faces so sour they'd curdle milk, trudging through misery like they were headed for a root canal with no anesthetic. Legend has it, the Middle Ages were a laughter black hole. Hardship squeezed the joy right out until not even a snicker remained. But reality, of course, had the last laugh. Medieval manuscripts? Basically ancient meme boards, packed with doodled monkeys mooning monks and snails locking horns in epic duels with knights. If peasants earned a penny for every groan-worthy pun scribbled in the margins, they'd own half the manor by now. Then there was the Feast of Fools, an upside-down festival featuring donkey parades, mock sermons, and pranks so wild they'd make today's party crashers blush. Some peasants even dared to poke fun at their lords, though always when the bigwigs weren't looking, naturally. So while peasants laughed at the cow's expense, that cow probably thought, moving on from this comedy show. Turns out, laughter was their secret weapon, a medieval must-have right alongside the turnips.